They thought you were slow. Not because you were, but because you let them believe it. You played the fool with such elegance that it became art. You let them underestimate your silence, mistake your restraint for confusion, your empathy for blindness. That was your brilliance. You let them build castles of deceit on foundations you already mapped out. They walked around, smug and satisfied, whispering behind your back as if your ears were never trained for subtext. But you heard everything. You felt everything. And most dangerously, you understood. You understood it all before it happened. That's what haunts them now. That's what keeps them pacing at night while you sleep like a sovereign. Unbothered, untouchable. You didn't expose them because you were weak. You waited, because genius has patience. They assumed their games were beneath your radar, but your mind was orbiting their entire operation. You let them speak in circles, trip over their own contradictions, bask in temporary control, all while cataloging their every move like a surgeon tracking arteries before the incision. That's the power of a dangerous IQ. You don't need to shout. You just know. And knowing is the most terrifying weapon in a world that thrives on illusion. When you see through people faster than they can fabricate, you don't argue. You calculate. You don't need to react. You design consequences. That's what they never saw coming. You weren't trying to win the game. You were redesigning the board, brick by silent brick, until their every move only advanced your endgame. You knew what they were doing even when they thought they were clever. You caught the flicker in their eye, the subtle delay in their text, the way they rewrote a memory in public to gaslight you in private. You recorded it, not with a device, but with cognitive precision. You took mental screenshots with timestamps and emotional fingerprints. And when the moment came, you didn't confront. You concluded. You disconnected without a sound. You left them mid-sentence, mid-strategy, mid-performance. And that ghosted silence became their psychological prison. They don't miss your presence. They miss your permission. You were their audience. Now you're the one writing the reviews. From a throne, not a therapist's chair. People fear what they can't predict. And your intellect made you unpredictable. Not because you were erratic, but because you were surgical, calculated, unreadable. You let them show their cards while you played a different game entirely. You were building an empire of knowledge while they were busy performing competence. You sat back, not in ignorance, but in watchfulness. They told you who they were, and you remembered. They slipped. You documented. They lied. You archived. And now, as they watch you rise with zero warning, their minds scramble for a rewind button that never existed. They can't process how you knew the entire time. Because if you knew and still smiled, still stayed, still played along, then you were never the target. You were the architect. It wasn't luck. It was data. While they were improvising, you were pattern tracking. While they were assuming, you were observing micro expressions. You didn't just notice what they did. You understood why. That's the kind of clarity that strips people naked. You saw the origin of their manipulation. The insecurities, the jealousies, the unspoken envy wrapped in passive compliments. You saw the root, and rather than cutting the branches, you stepped back and let the rot become visible to everyone else. That's intelligence with fangs. Intelligence that doesn't chase. It reveals. You didn't fall for their mask because you studied the muscle movements behind it. That's what makes you lethal. Not just that you know, but that you understand on levels they can't even imagine. You let them think they were leading. That's what hurts them now. That they felt in charge while you were actually mapping their weaknesses. You weren't quiet because you were shy. You were quiet because you were designing an escape route they couldn't follow. Now they see the aftermath. The empire you built from the ruins of their manipulation, and they stand frozen, not by guilt, but by awe, because they never anticipated a mind that didn't scream when hurt, that didn't panic under pressure. You read them like fiction, and they thought they were mystery. That level of perception, it destroys egos, and you didn't even lift a weapon. You just stopped explaining yourself. Here's the psychology of it. People who manipulate others usually do so because they're terrified of being seen. They crave control because exposure dents to their identity. And when someone like you comes along, someone who sees without needing confirmation, it terrifies them. Your silence became their spotlight. Your gaze became their reckoning. They weren't prepared to be known without being told. They wanted to manage your perception, but you managed your reaction. And now, you live rent-free in their heads, not as someone they defeated, but as someone whose awareness they can't escape. Every lie they speak now echoes with the fear that you might be listening, that you might appear again, calm and collected, holding the truth like a guillotine. They can't rewrite the past anymore. That's the torture. They can't manipulate the memory of what they did, because you were conscious during every scene. You didn't forget. You just forgave them before they asked, not out of kindness but strategy. You allowed them to think you were healing, while in reality you were building. And when the dust settled, you emerged like a myth. Stronger, smarter, scarier. Not because you held a grudge, but because you held receipts. And the idea that someone remembers everything, without ever needing to retaliate, is more terrifying than vengeance. You didn't play the revenge game, you became the proof. They weren't looking for honesty. They were orchestrating theater. They didn't want truth. They wanted tantrums. Because if they could provoke you enough to break, to scream, to throw everything on the floor in an explosion of pain and fury, they'd finally have something they could use. That was the objective. Not resolution, not understanding, but collapse. Your collapse, they wanted witnesses to your unraveling. They needed it to look dramatic, unhinged, violent even, because then they could twist the entire narrative. Then they could say, "See, I told you they were unstable." And suddenly, everything they did to you would be justified. The lies, the omissions, the microaggressions, the public smear jobs wrapped in jokes. All forgiven by your one slip. That was the game. They didn't need to defeat you in truth. They just needed to bait you into handing them the weapon. They watched for weakness, not emotional vulnerability. They loved that. What they waited for was a fracture in your discipline. That moment where the silence snapped and your volume rose. That instant where your self-control broke and your hands shook. Because then, they could drag you out of context. Show people the ending without the beginning. Make sure the camera rolled only when your voice hit a pitch, not when they spent months scraping your dignity with dull razors. They wanted the clip, the quote, the image of you out of character. They needed your chaos to validate their covered cruelty. And every time you refused to give it to them, they lost another limb of the fantasy they were building. You were never allowed to feel, only to react. And if you did react destructively, they'd call it proof. Not pain, not trauma, just evidence of what they'd been saying all along. This was psychological warfare. They didn't come at you directly. That would have made things too obvious. No, they opted for death by 1,000 emotional paper cuts. Slow burns. Questions with sharp edges. Compliments with teeth. They wanted you irritated, exhausted, eroded. Because the moment you cracked, even once, they could pretend the rest was your imagination. They didn't want to solve the issue. They wanted to perform one. One where you were the villain, the overreactor, the drama. If they could push you far enough off balance, they'd frame the push as self-defense. Suddenly your rage was the cause, not the consequence. They knew exactly what they were doing. You were a character in a play they were directing. And they cast you as chaos, not because you were, but because it excused their control. They studied you. That's what makes this so sinister. They learned your triggers, your limits, your tells. They knew how far they could go before you'd flinch. And when you did, they'd smile softly like they didn't mean it, like you misunderstood. And if you reacted, they'd offer that same passive tilt of the head, that disgusted sigh masked as disappointment. You're overreacting. They said it enough to make you question your reality. But don't, because now you know the truth. This wasn't accidental. This was theater, and you were expected to throw the first stone, so they could build a monument to their victimhood. You didn't break because you were weak. You broke because they were mining for it. And the second you refused to hand them the meltdown, they started falling apart instead. They needed you to crack so the spotlight could shift. Because as long as you held your silence, the tension stayed on them. And pressure, as we know, exposes character. They couldn't endure it, so they tried to export it. Shift the weight to your shoulders. Break you so loudly that their damage went unheard beneath your chaos. It was always about optics, never resolution. They weren't threatened by your strength. They were terrified of your restraint, because restraint left them exposed, accountable. So they baited you, needled you, waiting for that one text, that one voice note, that one message they could screen record and forward to their carefully selected jury. See, look how unhinged they are. All while deleting the months of quiet emotional abuse they delivered in smiles and winks. And when you didn't give it to them, when you stayed still while they thrashed, when you smiled while they slandered, they began to panic because they realized something dangerous. You weren't reactive, you were aware. That's what they can't manipulate. A mind that doesn't flinch, a heart that doesn't hand over its dignity for the sake of being understood. You chose stillness where the expected spectacle. And stillness is the enemy of their narrative. Stillness makes people curious. Stillness makes people look. And when they look, they start asking questions. They rewind. They observe the whole story, not just the last 5 minutes. And in that full replay, you stop being the villain. You become the evidence. There's a psychology to this, and it's cruel. Those who lack control will do anything to make others lose theirs. It levels the field. It evens the power. They couldn't touch your integrity. So they tried to compromise it, not through brute force, but through emotional contamination. Let me stain their name with their own reaction. That was the strategy. But it only works when you break, when you respond on their terms. And you were too precise. You didn't yell. You documented. You didn't beg, you archived. You didn't destroy them. You let their own behavior do the heavy lifting. That's high-level revenge. That's the kind of intelligence that doesn't need fireworks, only time and truth. They couldn't handle the long game because lies are sprinters. Truth is endurance, and you outlasted the mask. Now, the people they convinced are starting to return with questions. Why were you so obsessed with proving their flaws? Why do you sound rehearsed? Why did they leave with dignity? And you're still talking about them. The questions are growing teeth, and they're bleeding under the weight of their own narrative. They wanted a villain so badly, they built one. But when you refused the costume, they had to wear it themselves. That's poetic justice. That's psychological warfare returned to sender. In silence, in power, in calm.